Hello, and welcome to Talking About Regeneration, the podcast that's all about stem cell and regenerative medicine, and some other stuff too. I'm Kevin McCormack, Communications Director at CIRM. We're California's stem cell agency, and we have $5.5 billion to change the world. And this podcast will introduce you to some of the people who are going to help us do just that. Enjoy the show. Our guest today is an old friend and colleague of people here at CIRM, Dr. Paul Knoepfler. Paul is a stem cell scientist. Full disclosure here, we have funded some of his work, but he is so much more than that. He's one of the most prolific bloggers and writers about stem cell research, an author of several books about the field, and a fierce foe of clinics that offer bogus therapies. He's also a TED speaker and the author of a book about how to build a dragon. So we have a lot to cover. Paul, welcome to Talking About Regeneration, the CIRM podcast. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty well considering, the pandemic and everything.
Has that affected your work at all?
It slowed things down somewhat, but we're gradually kind of getting back up to speed.
Sounds great. How did you get interested in stem cell research?
Yeah, it actually was a little bit indirect because I was studying cancer research as a postdoctoral fellow up in Seattle at the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center. And a lot of focus on the particular factors that we were studying, these were oncogenes or cancer-causing genes, was really narrowly focused on exactly trying to sort out how they cause cancer. But it occurred to me, we didn't know much about what they do normally because these genes are around in normal cells. They're not just in cancer cells. So it turned out a lot of the genes that cause cancer have important functions in stem cells. And that kind of shifted my focus from sort of entirely on cancer to also be on cancer and stem cells both.
So is that still your focus in looking at cancer stem cells?
Yeah, we're still pretty interested in kind of how stem cells and cancer cells are almost like cousins in a way. Even I should say cancer cells that are not technically cancer stem cells. A lot of times just everyday run-of-the-mill cancer cells do have traits similar to stem cells. And so what we're hoping is by sort of trying to navigate and learn about all the circuitry of the gene expression and all these things in stem cells and cancer cells, we can come up with both new treatments to get at the cancers, but also make stem cell therapies safer.
It seems from what I'm reading, it seems like for every answer we get, it unveils 3 or 4 more questions about why that's the case.
Yeah, it does seem that way. It's not like we get to sort of an endpoint and we have the final answer and time to do something different. It's always more complicated than we think and more interesting, which is kind of part of what makes it fun.
Yeah. So how has the field evolved since you first started?
Yeah, I think, I thinking back to when I've been here at UC Davis for almost 15 years. Back then, the stem cell field was really different in a lot of ways. I think on one level, sort of the debate at that time was over embryonic stem cell research and should federal funding of that be legal? And that really generated a lot of attention. It sort of sucked a lot of the oxygen at the policy level out, in that direction. Now I think things are really different. There's a lot more clinical trials going on. So I think there's reason for optimism on that front. And there's sort of different debates going on, like what's the best way to regulate different kinds of stem cell therapies? What should be the proper role of the FDA? How should regulators, whether it's the FDA or similar groups abroad, how should they try to balance promoting innovation, but also, sticking to high standards, requiring a lot of data? And so those are kind of a lot of more of the discussions we're having. I think another change was that sort of early in my career as a professor, Dr. Yamanaka found out how to make these iPS cells. So that really changed things too. And I was studying this factor called MYC at the time, which is one of these oncogenes that also does really important normal stuff in stem cells. So it was really exciting for me to see that one of his reprogramming factors in his famous cocktail was MYC, although MYC ended up not being as essential as perhaps the other factors. But it just sort of really stirred things up and I think got people thinking more creatively. So those are some of the changes. I think also we're facing some difficulties that are different now than they were back then, namely these unproven stem cell clinics, we call them for lack of a better name, have really exploded in the US. So when I started in 2006 here at UC Davis, there really weren't any stem cell clinics in the US, maybe literally one of them or something like that. And now we can't really be sure because it's such a moving target, but there could be 1,000 of them in the US. So I've sort of taken it upon myself to be sort of a critic of them and kind of push back on what they're doing. So that's been an interesting sort of small slice of my professional life, as well as I'm spending most of my time, in the lab, writing grants, things like that.
Yeah, because I know in the past we used to call it stem cell tourism because people would go overseas to other countries to get these therapies that hadn't been proven to be either safe or effective. But as you say, increasingly we're seeing that here in the US, particularly in states like California. So what got you interested in becoming kind of like a foe of these clinics in a way?
Yeah, it was interesting. So in 2009, I had this dramatic experience in my life of being diagnosed with cancer. And at the time, prior to that happening, I had sort of been toying with the idea of maybe launching a stem cell blog. Way back then, that was, almost 12 years ago. There were, as far as I know, I think there might have only been 1 or 2 blogs on stem cells in the world.
Yeah,
and
that was way back in the early days, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, way back. And one of them was a blog that also had the same name that my blog has now, The Niche, which was run by Nature. But it was, I think, late in 2009, they shut theirs down. And so there really wasn't much out there on the internet. Those were sort of the earlier days of the internet in the way of stem cells. So after sort of bouncing back from the cancer experience, I thought, if I can deal with that, I think I can handle, potential pushback on a professor, running a blog. And so anyhow, long story short, I started that blog. And a lot of the early sort of focus was on embryonic stem cells, pluripotent stem cells, iPS cells, because that sort of was the initial name of the blog was, that was our URL is ipscell.com. But what happened is over time, sometimes I would talk about other things. I would talk about adult stem cells. And I was surprised because suddenly little trickles started appearing in my email inbox of not my usual emails, not my colleagues and other stuff, but patients were starting to read the blog that I was doing. And I was really thinking, and this was more something that would mainly be scientists reading. And gradually what's happened is over time, a larger and larger slice of people reading the site is actually consists of patients. And so they started telling me their stories about how they were going to different clinics. And way back when I started the blog in 2010, some of that, a good portion of that was the stem cell tourism kind of way we think about things like, oh, maybe I'll go to Asia or the Caribbean or somewhere in Europe to a clinic. And what's really sort of flipped on its head is that now when I hear from patients, almost uniformly, they're talking about going down to their, within their own city, just going down 20 minutes from home to a strip mall, maybe go to a clinic, and so they're starting to increasingly tell me about their worries about that and ask what questions they should ask. So it was in part, I think it was the patients sort of telling me this is a new sort of trend. The other thing that was happening is that some colleagues were, especially in the bioethics area and policy area of research, were getting increasingly concerned about sort of the same thing happening, but they were sort of coming at it from another angle. And they were seeing, it really seems like now we're seeing a few more clinics here in the US, and these clinics are really pushing back against the FDA. So altogether, sort of conversations with patients and colleagues who are really not the usual colleagues I interact with, like biologists like me, but more on the ethics side, were telling me it all sort of came together and was like, this is an emerging potential problem that we're having. And so, I guess I feel very strongly about when the science sort of evolves towards the clinic, that you really need to be very rigorous about it. You need a lot of data. And in my view, I think you should be sort of working with the FDA as much as possible, sort of like a partner. I know realistically from talking to people who run clinical trials at the FDA, it can be kind of stressful trying to meet all the requirements of the FDA and everything.
Absolutely,
But
yeah. But that's
yeah,
for safety. I mean, that's
it
why,
is. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, for sure. So I think um, it all sort of came together for me as something that maybe there could be a sort of a unique role for me in trying to raise awareness about this problem, help people make more educated decisions about it. And as this was sort of all unfolding over a period of years, it really started to feel like I was making a difference. Like sometimes patients would circle back and be like, oh, I decided not to take that risk, or I decided not to have my kid get injected with, who knows what for autism, or
Yeah,
so
because
there's,
we would get loads of calls at CERM along the same lines about, should I go here? Is that okay? And often it felt, even if you tried to kind of say that there's no real evidence that what they're doing could help you, it was almost as if they were calling up not to say, is this safe, but they wanted me to give them permission to go.
right. I
And
had,
I'd always ask,
yeah.
if you would go, let me know what happens. And
Uh-huh.
almost no one ever did.
Yeah, my experience is pretty similar. I think a lot of the time, some of the time patients would also sort of report after the fact. They were like, oh, I went to this clinic. I'm not sure it really did me any good. I just wondering, should I worry about something happening to me later
Yeah.
on? When I did ask patients to circle back, fortunately a few did, but I would say most did not. So it's sort of a mystery, and my guess is probably maybe the majority of them did go ahead and go to the clinics. And I wish I knew how that turned out. And in fact, in sort of our area in the field of stem cell bioethics and policy kind of research, that's
Mhm.
really a gap, is that we don't know how often things go well, because maybe sometimes things go fine, and how often it's sort of in the middle, and how often it's really bad stuff.
Yeah. And I always wonder what happens as well, because you think if they have a good experience, surely they'd want to come back and talk about it. Maybe those are the ones that end up giving testimonials, video testimonials on these
Yeah,
clinics' websites. And then the rest are just thinking, well, there was $5,000 I wasted. And we're either
right.
too embarrassed or just couldn't be bothered to tell me. I've had friends who've had that kind of, that particularly say
Mhm.
for knees, that have been
Yeah.
kind of injured over many years playing sports. And they said at first it felt fine, but then after a month or so, it was pretty much back to where it had been.
Yeah, that's very kind of fits with what I've been experiencing in my conversations with different people I know who have gotten these kinds of treatments. Is usually, if there is any perceived benefit, it's maybe a month, maybe 2 months. And unfortunately, that's more consistent with a placebo kind of effect. We're all susceptible to that. If someone
Oh,
gives
yeah.
us a pill or we get a shot or something, our body somehow, it's still kind of a mystery how it happens, but somehow we get this feeling like maybe things are better, but that typically then kind of fades off after a month or two. So
And if you
again,
just spent $5,000, that's a heck of an incentive to
or
believe
10,
that it's going to
right,
work, right?
or 10,000. Yeah. In the prices, I've also done some work trying to get a better sense of the prices, which seem to be kind of creeping up at these clinics.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really not that unusual for it to be $5, 10, $15,000. And then because of this sort of fade effect, which maybe is a placebo related thing in a lot of cases, then the clinics are, come back, we'll give you another shot, maybe 20% off,
Yeah.
so instead of 5,000, maybe 4,000, but it still adds up to 9,000, for the two shots. And so it doesn't really seem like a lasting benefit is, a reality at the vast majority of these clinics.
Yeah. And it's very lucrative for these clinics, as you talked about, like $5,000 or $10,000. I talked to a doctor once who was offered a chance to go on a weekend training course, and it would cost him $5,000 and then another, I think, $20,000 for a centrifuge. And the idea was that, you just take some fat or blood stem
Mhm.
cell or blood cells from someone, put it through the centrifuge, and then inject what's left into the patient. It's their own fat and blood. It's all done the same day. So for like $25,000, he had this business that you can make that up in a few days with just a few patients. So it's
Yeah,
it's it's easy to see why a lot of clinics jump on that. I mean, it's kind of it's a ready-made cash machine.
it is. And I think what you've touched on is sort of another level to this, or sort of another phenomenon, which is there are people sort of selling the idea of, they're almost like consultants who are selling the idea of starting this kind of element to your medical practice or your chiropractic practice. And they make money by getting people to sort of jump on the bandwagon. Like you were saying, for a relatively small investment, they might make $500,000 or $1 million by injecting people with who knows what, for what purpose. And So I think part of the problem is there's obviously sort of an attractiveness to the idea of big money quickly, being made. But the sad part is all these patients, at a minimum have false hope, and some do get, we definitely have seen people get hurt. Some people got infections for sort of shoddily produced products. So there really are risks to this, but it's got an appeal and there is demand, right? There's a lot of people walking around with like knee issues or hip issues or all kinds of other problems that sort of are traditional medicine, not really traditional, but conventional medicine they don't feel like they're getting helped enough, and there's only so many steroid injections you can get in your knee. Yeah.
They don't want to go through knee surgery. They don't want to have a knee replacement or a hip replacement. So if someone says, I can give you an injection of your own stem cells and you won't have to go through any of that, that sounds very attractive.
It does, yeah. And so it's been reassuring to see that the FDA has sort of become more engaged in this problem. Some of us have been sort of nagging them or pestering them for probably almost a decade. Hey, there's a problem here. And in past administrations, we didn't get a lot of traction with that. Weirdly enough, during the Trump administration, the FDA, I think already prior to that, they were sort of getting the ball rolling on this, and it just sort of continued over the last 4 or 5 years. And the FDA's done, I think, a much better job on that. And we've just seen this week that they've sort of recommitted themselves publicly to sort of sticking with this problem and addressing clinics that remain sort of, I guess you could say, non-compliant, is sort of the technical way of saying it, like not following the FDA rules. You're probably familiar, the FDA sort of gave clinics a grace period, first of 3 years, and they kind of extended it to 3.5 years. And that now will end in May. And the FDA has said, they're not going to extend it further. So I think that provides sort of another boost, another shot of hope that maybe they're really going to crack down on at least some of the most scary clinics out there that are doing all kinds of wild stuff.
It'd be interesting to see if they do and how quickly, because I know that the number of clinics seems to grow all the time. And you and Lee Turner have done articles and kind of pieces about the numbers of clinics that are out there. It's got you quite a bit of national attention. Are you surprised at that?
Yeah, I think initially Lee and I, we had this important paper in 2016 that sort of for the first time really sort of got data on these clinics. And I think, I can't really speak for Lee, but I think my impression is he and I were both equally surprised at the numbers. We saw these really big numbers. And I think both of us were sort of hoping that having some actual numbers would be sort of a concrete, almost like an anchor for people like the FDA to now say, look, it's not just people like Lee Turner and Paul Knoepfler saying there's a problem, there's a number to it, and we actually documented where all these were. And we, so I think that there was sort of a novel element to actually having data on these clinics. There were some past publications here or there about clinics internationally, like, oh, there's one here or there, but this was really a systematic analysis. So I think I was sort of pleasantly surprised that the media especially really got interested in it and kind of ran with the story. And then my sense is that it really, that data set, that information, and sort of getting it all out there in the media was sort of a spur to the FDA to jump on this a little more seriously and with more resources. And it's hard because as an agency, they're responsible for so many things.
Yeah, I know. It's amazing, isn't it?
It's almost like we had to convince them, this is really a serious threat, both to patients, but also in a way to the FDA's credibility, because there were hundreds of these businesses marketing arguably unapproved drug products. And that's really all against the FDA's mission. It's really, they're very serious about people selling, for instance, pharmaceuticals that don't have FDA approval. So we were sort of arguing, if it's a stem cell drug, quote unquote, it's still something that you should be worried about if people are not getting your approval, to use it. So
absolutely. Yeah. And I think you're right. I think the fact that you and Lee were able to put a number on it, and such a high number, made people step up and realize that this isn't just something that happens in a few isolated places or in Mexico or wherever.
Right.
This is happening all over the US. And I think because it was that big a number and because it was all over the US, that really made an impression.
Yeah, it really felt like, and actually talking to people behind the scenes at the FDA, who are a little bit shy perhaps about going on the record about stuff, I think the sense I got from them was, yeah, this actually really helped them. It was sort of like a tool for them to move forward and address this more directly.
You've also written a couple of books about stem cell research and given a TED talk on the subject of gene editing and also the dangers of using tools like CRISPR, gene editing tools like CRISPR to create designer babies. Why is that such a concern for you?
Yeah, that's sort of another story. It was probably about 6 years ago I got interested in CRISPR as a tool in my own lab because we do a lot of genetic work. We're interested in these cancer-causing genes and stem cell regulatory genes, and a lot of what we would do would be doing genetics, sort of traditional genetics in mice. And mice are a great model, but they're not human. So we were really excited. I was very excited 6, 7 years ago about CRISPR, CRISPRing human cells and actually doing genetic work in human cells like human stem cells or cancer cells. And so this was back, 2014, 2015. And that already seems like kind of a long time ago. But for me, time kind of went by quickly. But anyhow, it sort of occurred to me in talking with colleagues, and I knew a lot of colleagues who were also interested in applying CRISPR like in agricultural ways, whether it's plants or especially like in farm animals, things like that. And there's sort of a light bulb moment when it really sort of resonated for me. If we can CRISPR human stem cells, a fertilized egg, a human fertilized egg is a cell. And so you can CRISPR that too. And it just sort of suddenly, I know other people, it was sort of already on their minds, but for me, at least, it was sort of a light bulb moment. It was like, then you could implant that fertilized egg and make a person, and they would have.
It's one of those, oh my God moments.
Right. Yeah. It was, this is not just in a plastic dish in the lab to learn something, from research, which is exciting. And we do that all the time. And so then it was a matter of, would someone actually do that? And there was already at that time, I'm thinking back to like 2015, there was a lot of hand wringing going on behind the scenes, mostly not out in public. But amongst people using CRISPR and some of the CRISPR pioneers and things like that, it also, I think, even earlier for them had occurred to them, oh, this could be done in embryos, And so just having been a researcher who's done a lot of genetics work, like in mice over decades now, that makes me sound really old, but it's the reality. I guess I saw like a lot of times things don't go the way scientists think they're going to go. It's always more complicated than you think. You get one answer and it sort of leads to another question. And so the same is really true with CRISPR. And I think it sort of got portrayed as this smart bomb, like super accuracy, GPS kind of thing. Yeah. There's all kinds of metaphors and things that have been used for CRISPR, like, a Swiss Army. I've also myself called it like a Swiss Army knife for the genome. Other people talk about genome surgery, but the reality is it actually sometimes doesn't work that well. And so initially I got really concerned that someone would try, perhaps to correct a disease-causing mutation in a human embryo, implant that embryo, and then the person who was born, maybe there would be damage to their genome from CRISPR doing the wrong thing, which happens sometimes. It also occurred to me someone might, instead of trying to go down a path to help a genetic disease family or patient, they might use this to try to tweak traits, and that's where I started thinking more about the designer baby thing. And in fact, pretty early on, people were already using CRISPR like in pigs to change, not just for disease research, but to modify the animals in a certain way, like make them have more muscle or things like that. And it occurred to me, well, pigs have like the gene that was being CRISPRed in pigs, we have the same gene in people. And don't a lot of people want more muscles? And so, if you CRISPR that, could someone go down that path? And so it sort of crystallized for me in 2015 that someone is probably going to do this, just because CRISPR is fairly easy to try to use. It's actually fairly hard to get it to work precisely all the time, or most of the time. And so it just sort of occurred to me, someone's probably going to do this. And so in 2015, I sort of, through my blog and just going to different meetings and things, I really was advocating for a temporary moratorium on using CRISPR in people in a heritable way, like, making quote unquote CRISPR babies, making.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, and there were other people obviously who were advocating for that same thing. And I guess part of what my fear was at the time is that there would be this generation of babies born maybe who had a lot of problems, and maybe suffered and things because CRISPR was used in them, and it goofed up their DNA, and caused problems. And I don't know why, but for me, somehow that really resonated, something that I cared a lot about, trying to sort of push back against, make a little dent in the momentum. And not just me, but many people like Dr. Doudna were worried that someone was going to do this, and then lo and behold, I think
yes, exactly. I was just going to mention that. Yeah, everything that you'd feared happened. That one doctor in China.
Right. So this guy, He Jiankui, actually did make what I think it turned out to be 3 babies who he had introduced CRISPR into them when they were embryos. And his goal was sort of complicated, but in a nutshell, I think he was hoping to make children who had a lower chance of getting infected by HIV.
Yeah.
But he really went off the rails. And as far as we know, there's not a lot of data on it, but the CRISPR probably didn't go that well. And there probably are some potential risks for those 3 babies that he made I guess they're a couple of years old now, as they grow up. And if they had some CRISPR artifact introduced into their DNA, they'll probably pass that along to their children and so on. And
that's the scary part, isn't it? Because you're working at an embryonic level where just small changes may have massive implications for later in life that we have no idea about.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, some people said, well, it's not like it's going to be the end of the world that this guy made 3 CRISPR babies. And that's true. There's just these 3 individuals. But, if you think over generations, other things could happen in their children. And I guess I was more concerned that not so much about individual cases, but it might sort of catch on. And again, it might be people going for trait modification, like to be looking more like a movie star, or,
I've seen science fiction movies. This could be the end of the world, as we know.
Right. It kind of brings to mind other things like Gattaca or Brave New World. And I know some scientists kind of object to those, sci-fi or fantasy kinds of works being invoked in this context, but it really does have a sort of feel of that, like we could be going down that path. And part of it is just because CRISPR is really easy to try to use, and a lot of times it does work, but a lot of times it doesn't work that well. So
but I think it's important to invoke those kind of images, because then that conveys exactly what we're talking about to a wider public who don't need to necessarily understand all of what CRISPR does, but they need to understand the implications for what it might do. And I think that's a really powerful way of getting that message across.
Yeah, I agree. And I think part of what's been interesting for me about the last 6 years since I sort of engaged more on the CRISPR policy side is just, there's sort of the world inside of science and medicine, but then I oftentimes sort of find myself outside that world, and you can't use all this jargon. And sometimes you do, it is helpful if you do invoke like movies or books or things to help people kind of get a grasp on, this is really what we're talking about, rather than some really complicated jargon.
Which leads us neatly to the thing about you and your daughter Julie writing a book called How to Build a Dragon or Die Trying, a satirical look at cutting-edge science. So what's that about, and how did it come about?
Yeah, that's really been a fun project for my daughter and I. So the start of that story is sort of back in junior high, funnily enough. So I think she was in 8th grade. She was in a biology class, and her teacher, every year they had kind of like a science fair kind of thing. And so some people might have had this experience as parents or even themselves when they were a kid. You make a poster, like some people do an experiment, quote unquote, like, testing out Pepsi versus Coke with their friends, or, Diet Coke versus regular Coke, or salty potato chips versus, they basically do small sort of fun experiments. I'm trying to think back to I have 3 daughters. My other 2 daughters also did different kinds of experiments that were sort of hands-on, like analyzing water quality under a microscope or something. So Julie had sort of a creative, very different idea, which was more conceptual, which was rather than, analyzing plants' response to sugar in their water or something like that, her idea was, could you actually imagine how to build a new creature? And an exciting creature is a dragon. So let's think about that. And so that was her idea. And her teacher gave her permission to do this more almost like theoretical exercise and make a poster talking about the steps that would be involved. And so as Julie was sort of putting that together, we would often like walk our dog every evening, and we would sort of talk about it. And it sort of just occurred to me that could be kind of a fun book, and she got a really positive response at the science fair. A lot of people were sort of laughing and interested, laughing in sort of a good way. Like, this is sort of fun, and interesting, and sparks the imagination. So me, sort of more being both a scientist and writer, sort of clicked for me, hey, this could be a fun book. And she was game to try it. So we pitched the idea to my previous publisher. They were excited about it. So that's how it sort of germinated. And it was just really fun putting it together and doing the research together.
That sounds great. So finally, with all this work going on, if you hadn't been a scientist, if you hadn't got interested in all this research, what would you have become? What would you have liked to have become?
That's a great question. I've actually thought about that too, because, all of our sort of paths in life are not as set as we sometimes think. And so little things could change one's trajectory and push you, say, away from science towards something else. So I don't know that I know for sure what my fate would have been, but it could easily have been more of a focus on just being someone who's just writing more full-time, like a science writer. Another possibility is just I have really strong interests that are outside of science already, like gardening, and I do have sort of a family history of farming, so I could have potentially been a farmer. I really like sort of having my own little miniature farm in the backyard.
I've seen pictures of your tomatoes. Yeah, it's very impressive.
Yeah, but I'm always drawn back to science, because even with my tomatoes, I'm growing these they haven't been genetically modified, but they've been sort of bred out by this Napa area tomato production little family farm kind of thing called Wild Boar Farms that makes, they essentially make genetic changes in tomatoes just by breeding them, and get all kinds of wild varieties. So I'm always drawn towards growing these sort of wild striped tomatoes that have blue colors in them and all kinds of things. So I feel like even if I hadn't been a, full-time scientist, I probably would have been, the gravity of it would have pulled me back towards pulling science into farming or writing, or, it would have always been an element in what I did.
Right. Well, the loss to the world of farming is a gain to the world of science. We're grateful for that. Paul, thank you. It's been delightful chatting with you. And thanks for being on our podcast, and good luck with the research.
Thank you very much.
That's our show for today, and thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm Kevin McCormack, and I'll be back with another edition of Talking About Regeneration soon. Thanks very much.